going on, Geeklings? Tonight is night 6 of Spooktober, and tonight I'm going to read you a couple short stories. I do want to give the warning that I do not scare very easily, and I chose stories that scare even me, so these stories may be a little on the dark side, so just be prepared for that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. The first story is titled Gray, like the color. I've tried everything I can think of, but enough is enough. I first noticed the thing when I looked up at my window after taking a short nighttime walk. At first, I reasoned that it was just my mom putting something in my room, but as I came closer and looked harder, I saw its shape was hardly feminine, hardly even human. What stood in my window was a tall, skinny figure, completely nude and lanky, like a awkward teenager. Its skin the color of gray. It stood much taller than I did, and it looked down from my window whenever I was outside my house. Its face was much more humanoid than the rest of its portions. It had a mouth, a nose, and 2 sunken eyes, the whites of which shone like dimmed car headlights. It had an expression that was difficult to read, fear mixed with possibly exuberation, and entirely psychotic. The first night I saw it, it just stared down at me. I didn't move. I didn't move at all. I couldn't. I was just dumbfounded by its presence. I felt a sneaking dread climb up my spine and settle on my neck. My mother and sister were in this house with that monster. I snapped out of it and ran for the door. But when I burst through, nothing was amiss. My family members sat downstairs watching television, as they always did. Panting, I stood before the screen, and I looked at them, wondering how they could have not noticed someone breaking into our home. Looks of concern came on both of their faces. "What's the matter?" my mom asked, frowning. "There's someone upstairs," I exclaimed. "What?" She cried, her voice raised. That's impossible. I've been here the whole time. I saw him in the window. Without waiting for them to follow, I stormed up the stairs, determined to catch the criminal. I took a baseball bat from the closet on the way, and without a moment's hesitation, I exploded into my bedroom. The gray being had inexplicably vanished, gone without a trace. I checked my sister's room, my mother's room, every bathroom, closet, and pantry that I could. The thing had just disappeared. Somehow its vanishing disturbed me more than it actually being there. That night, I barely slept, waiting for it to emerge from some excellent hiding spot, but it never did. After that, I flicked up to my window every time I was outside, and every single time I saw that thing glaring down at me, judging me like I was the freak. Sometimes I locked eyes with it, making threatening gestures or flipping at the bird, just trying to stare it down or scare it off, or get any form of reaction. But it never affected it. It just stood there, watching, waiting. to seeing it whenever I walked my dog late at night, and even during the day when I looked up from my car as I parked it in the driveway, I decided I need to do something. And that was a mistake. First, I tried shutting the blinds and turning off the light before I went out with my dog. Sure enough, when I glanced up at my window, the thing had stood there as it always had before, with the blinds completely up and the light juxtaposing around its gray mass against my yellow-colored room. I climbed back up to my bedroom. The shades were as I had put them. I started to feel crazy, unsafe. I started sleeping downstairs. The second thing I tried worked about as well as the first. I stacked chairs and heavy boxes full of reams of paper before the window to see how determined this entity was. As I should have guessed, all the things had been removed from sight when I peered up at the gleaming portal. It just stood, alone, nothing else in view, its expression constant, its body not feeling my desperate eyes upon the gray of its form. As a final attempt before resorting to setting actual traps to catch the monster, I told my sister to check my room after I'd gone. She was still sitting on the couch when I walked through the front door, loath to postpone her sedentary life for even a few minutes. When I returned, she reported that my room was empty, but concerned, asked if I felt okay. Feeling the concerned looks and fearful eyes of my family members made me fearful for myself. For some weeks now, I've managed to come to terms with the gray being's existence. I looked at it less and less, and I found its presence to be of decreasing importance to me. It seemed as if we could occupy the same space in comfort, staying out of each other's way, each living our separate lives. I had completely forgotten about it when tragedy struck. It was a Saturday, a day I typically spend out with friends. The evening was a time of stress relief in the form of driving around the suburbs I live in and causing a ruckus in a variety of ways. I left around 4 in the afternoon, and it was only 4:26 when I received a frantic text from my mom urging me to come home. When I got back, I looked up to my window, remembering the being had become nearly invisible by its consistency. I froze when I saw this. Its gray, strange mouth was twisted upward in a horrid smile. I burst through the front door. My mom was collapsed on the front room carpet, telephone held limply in her hand, having just called the police. I knelt by her for a few moments, comforting her in her distress, wondering, where was my sister? Sentence after incoherent sentence streamed out of her mouth like dribble, so I left her there to check if the house had any clues as to why she was so distressed. My natural response upon entering my house is to get upstairs to my room as soon as socially acceptable. Logically, I would check there first. Each day, I awake, wishing I hadn't looked at all. Blood coated nearly every surface, as if some explosion of red paint is in it splattering onto the walls and ceiling. Parts of my sister were strewn on my bed, and on my desk a good deal of her torso lay still and motionless in the center of my carpet. Her face torn off and nailed to the wall with a pencil, the eyes missing and nowhere to be found. The eye holes were ghastly, elongated things, made to look like demons' eyes by the bloodied wall that was visible find them. I retched onto the crimson floor, making the stench in my room even more sickening than the hemoglobin iron smell that destroyed my nostrils mercilessly. I stumbled back stairs to my weeping mother and collapsed as she had. I did not cry, however, only thought, and it became clear to me then, this being is too dangerous to let live. I must avenge her. From then on, after police had come to retrieve the body and found no viable perpetrator of the crime, I spent most of my time at every public library in the county or on so-called witch websites I knew to be complete hoaxes, but still trying to find a method of purging this entity from my home. I ordered holy water to be bottled at the Jordan River, spread it in the still red room, only to see that same gray beast looking down upon me from within, its smile never leaving its face. No amount of charms or amulets, or even enchantments, could repel the gray being. I cast protection spells, spirit wards, positive repels, waving my hands in the air and chanting like an absolute maniac cultist. And even in a stupor of frustration, I tried pleading with the spirit, begging it, even trying to make a pact with it, leaving it offerings like it was some twisted god to be revered. But nothing could remove it from my window. And that brings me to my current state of mind. I've exhausted all possible means. I save summoning a demon of my own or burning my house to the ground. I would do the latter if I could convince my mother of the gray being's existence, but she always claims she can't see it when I show her its creeping vigilance. For some reason, I know nothing will ever rid me of this malevolence. That's why I've written this down, this explanation of my next action, so that in case the being takes me too, someone will know my tale. I want everyone to understand why I've done this, and make sure that this doesn't happen again, but I have chosen to climb to my roof and go in through that window to face that monster, face to face, with it having zero chance of escaping. Believe someone if they tell you that they are afraid. Believe in what causes their fear, no matter how preposterous, no matter how gray. I've tried everything I can think of, but enough is enough. This journal was found on Derek E. Weinman's person on February the 17th, among other personal effects, including a watch battery, a wallet containing identification and several bills, and a packet of Big League Chew. Derek's time of death was 8:34 p.m. on the February 17th. Cause of death still unknown, though the official statement has been announced as a suicide. No sign of a struggle, harmful chemicals, and toxicology was clean. Derek was lying face down on the floors of his room where his sister's body had been found. See OFCL report case 9A12, Vanessa D. Weinman. Please note that up to this, or every point after this in the journal becomes extremely difficult to read, but it seems to be the same message scrawled almost in a manic fashion over and over and over, the phrase repeating itself thousands of times until the journal runs out of paper, the phrase being, "Why am I so gray?" Next story. I know You know what the worst part about my situation is? I'm in the same room with my girlfriend, in the same bed. She keeps looking at me, and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Her eyes focused on me, and her mouth wide open. There's a strong scent of blood, and I feel so paralyzed with fear. Here's the thing. The second I make any hint that I am not asleep anymore, I am completely screwed. I will die, and there's nobody here to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only good idea I have is to rush for the door and run outside, screaming for help. Hoping any neighbors hear me is risky, but if I stay here, I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up. He's waiting for me to see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on, and I do get ahead of myself sometimes. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming coming from the other side of the house. I got up and realized that my girlfriend was not in bed with me, so I decided to go check on the noise before realizing that I had to use the bathroom. Instead of doing the smart thing and investigating, I used the bathroom first. I could have got myself killed if I had just gone to investigate her and maybe not be in this situation, but I actually did my business and took a peek outside the bathroom door. There's blood on the carpet. I got very worried, but ran back to the room, hiding under the sheets like the wimp that I am. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, that it was really just some vivid dream or something like that, that she would be back any moment. And she was. I heard the bedroom door open, and like a terrified child, I peeked from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging my dead girlfriend into the room. It wasn't human. I can tell you that it was hairless. It had no eyes and no clothing. It walked like a caveman with its black back slouched as it drug her body in. But this thing was much smarter than any caveman. It was aware of what it was doing. It propped her up at the edge of my bed and made her face me. It started rubbing its hands on the walls, staining them with blood, and then drew a circle with the devil's horns in it. This thing has made what it probably would have called a masterpiece, and to finish it off, scribbled a message onto the wall that I could not read in the darkness. It then positioned itself under my bed, waiting to strike. I can't look at what it wrote, but my eyes have adjusted to the darkness, and it is so hard for me to not, maybe just a quick peek, a quick look, just to see what it told me. It might not know. It might not know that I'm looking at it. I don't want to. It's terrifying me to think about it. I know if I look at it, I will be killed. I know that this monster just wants me to look at its masterpiece. I know that it... I turn and look at the message, and it says, "I know you're awake." This next story is called Abandoned by Disney. Some of you may have heard that the Disney Corporation is responsible for at least one real live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on the place. Yes, you heard that right. $30 million. And then they abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters too shallow for the ships to safely operate. And there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of sand, and it obviously wasn't because foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses for them to hide behind. No, I sincerely doubt these reasons were legitimate. Why don't I just buy the official story? Because of Mowgli's place. Near the beach side of Emerald Isle in North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mowgli's Place in the late 1990s. The concept was a jungle-themed resort with large, you guessed it, palace at the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Mowgli, then you might be better to remember the story of the Jungle Book. If you haven't seen it anywhere else, you'd know it as a Disney cartoon from decades past. Mowgli is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals, and simultaneously threatened and pursued by other animals. Mowgli's Place was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney brought up a ton of high-priced land for the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties immediately to Disney. At one point, a home that had just been constructed was immediately condemned with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly for some fictional highway project, with everyone knowing full well what was going on. People started calling it the Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was concept art. A group of stuffed shirts from Disney Company actually held a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. When they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace surrounded by the jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloths and tribal gear. Well, safe to say, everyone flipped their crap. We're talking about a large Indian place, jungle, and loincloths, not only in the center of a relatively wealth area, but also somewhat xenophobic area of the southern USA. It was a questionable mix at that point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over their knee as well. The houses were razed and the land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it, or even say. Local TV and newspapers were against the resort at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holdings and the local venues came into play, and their opinions turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Islands in the Bahamas. Disney sunk those millions in it, and then split. The same thing happened to Mowgli's Place. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual annoyances associated with an influx of lost and irate tourists. Then it all just stopped. Disney shut it down. Nobody knew what the heck to think about it, but they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious and wonderful to a large group of folks who didn't want this there in the first place. I honestly didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I live maybe 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so really, I'd only heard the rumblings and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I this article from someone who explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog of all this crazy stuff he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Heck, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Islands as people did here about Mowgli's place. Or Mowgli's palace. It has been palace this whole time. Plus, there are rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters when they closed, including sharks. Who wouldn't want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at in this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years had passed since its closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mowgli's palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there's anything I could take home as a memento. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there, because honestly, it took me another year after I first found that Treasure Island article to get around to going to Emerald Isle. Over the course of that year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or I rather tried to. Naturally, there is no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place, as if it had been scrubbed clean from their history. Even odder, however, was that nobody before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place or even post a photo. None of the local television or newspaper sites had one word on the place, though it was to be expected since they had all swung Disney's way. They wouldn't be out here just lauding their embarrassment, you know. Recently, I learned that corporations can actually ask Google, for example, to remove links from search results. Basically, for having to have no good reason. Looking back, it's probably not that nobody spoke about the resort, but rather the words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the palace. All I had to go on was an extremely old map I had received in the mail back in the 90s. It was a promotional item sent out to people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent enough. I didn't really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remembered it months into my research. And even then, it took another few weeks to locate the storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, as most were transplants who had moved to the beach in recent years, or old residents who sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where can I find Mo?" The drive took me through an inordinately long corridor of overgrowth. Tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with the native species of flora that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort. Tremendous, monolithic wooden gates, whose supports on either side looked like they had been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself had been gouged in several places from woodpeckers and eaten away at the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gate was a sheet of metal, some random scrap with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly, the handiwork of some past local or an employee who wanted to make some sort of small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not drive, so I grabbed my camera and the map, whose flip side showed the layout of the resort, and I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the place were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood untended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants stood similarly in their own stinking, bug-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of perennial flowers mixed with obnoxiously tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of any outdoor structures were broken wood and charred bits of unidentifiable material. There was most likely an information booth or an outside bar, which was simply now a pile of assorted debris, chopped up by past vandalism and ravaged by the weather. The most interesting thing on the grounds was a statue of Baloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial wave toward no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin, as bird poop covered whole swaths of his fur, and vines ensnared his platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find the outside of the building covered in graffiti, where the original paint had peeled and chipped away. Above the front doors, where the gaping maw where at least they had been, someone had once again painted, "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about the awesome stuff I found in the palace: forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums, but no. Inside the building was so stark, so bare, that I think people had actually stolen the molding off the walls. Everything that was too big to steal, the counters or the giant fig trees, were all resting amid this empty echo chamber that amplified every step with the slow rat-a-tat-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor plan and headed to any locations that seemed interesting. The kitchen was, as you imagined, an industrial food prep area, with all appliance and space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door kicked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled horrid. In the huge freezer, not even remotely cool now, had row upon row of empty shelf. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably for hanging cuts of meat, and as I stood aside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but the movements were slow and small, so it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footsteps, so I stopped one from swinging by clutching it with my fist, then carefully letting it go. But within seconds, it began to swing on its own again. Odd, I thought, but I pressed on. The bathrooms were in just the same state as the rest of the place, just like the Treasure Island Resort. Someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts or other implements. There was about half an inch of rancid, stinking, stagnant water on the floor, so I didn't stay in there very long. What's odd is that the toilets and the sinks and the bidets in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped or leaked or just simply ran freely. It seemed to me like they should have shut off the water long ago. It's been over a decade. Why would they continue to pay to have the water running? There's plenty of room in the resort, but naturally I didn't have time to go through them all. The few I did peer into were similarly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought there was actually a television or radio in one room, as I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out of it. But upon opening the door, I found nothing. Though it was like just a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of the flowing water playing tricks on my mind. But this is what it sounded like. I didn't believe it. Short, unknown reply. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you. Unknown reply, or possibly just weeping. I know that sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced, why I thought there might have been someone running in that room, or even out of it, or worse, some vagrants that had holed up there and probably would have shivved me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and wasted the trip up here. I looked at the door and noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I had apparently missed. Something that would have given me at least one thing to show for all my trouble, even if it was just a paragraph. There was a lifelike statue of a python, maybe 80 feet long, coiled up and sunning itself on a pedestal right in the center of the area, shaded, covered in the front by debris and bushes, making it impossible to see from the actual entrance to the palace. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on an object that landed a perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and snapped a photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer to get the detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head and directed its eyes and looked directly into my eyes, and turned and slithered off the pedestal across the grass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it, its head disappeared into the wood long before its tail left the sunning spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right here on my floor plan was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks at Treasure Isle. I should have known they'd do this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back to Earth and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times, backed away from where the snake had been, and back towards the palace. And even though it was totally gone, I still wasn't taking any chances. I backed my way into the building. I took a few steps. I took a few deep breaths and slapped my own face to get myself right in the head again after that. I looked for a place to sit down as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down because unless I wanted to recline in broken glass and deadlift carpet or haul myself up onto a desk with questionable reliability at best. I had seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the place of the building to be relatively clean, save for a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the "Abandoned by Disney" motto that I had become accustomed to. I placed the wedge on the stairs and sat on it to keep it at least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, below ground level. Using my camera flash as a sort of improvised flashlight, I could see that the staircase ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock, and on the door an actual real sign that read "Mascots Only. Thank you." This perked my spirits up a bit for two reasons. One, a mascots only area would have definitely had some interesting stuff back in the day. 2, the padlock was still in place and still locked. So, nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the only place I could actually explore without having so much damage, and perhaps find something interesting to photograph, or something to steal. I had come to the palace, essentially agreeing with myself that it was okay to take anything I wanted because, hey, it's been abandoned for 10 years. It didn't take much time to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's kind of wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of or been able to do at the time. The mascot's only area was a startling and very welcomed change from the rest of the building that I had seen. For one, every second or third floor sunlight overhead was illuminated, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken, even if age and exposure were definitely taking their toll. As I walked through the maze of the sub-basement-like hallways of the mascot's only area, the sights became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered, almost melted with the damp floor, and a large carpet of mold was slowly overtaking the real, rotting crimson floor covering. Everything just felt sort of squishy. The wood had disintegrated into mush, and when I applied even the least amount of floors and clothing items hanging on hooks in one of the rooms simply fell to moist threads if I tried to unhook them. One thing that annoyed me was the light coming from the sparse and that the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable the further I went into the dark, suffocating depths of the palace. Eventually, I reached a black and yellow striped door with the words "Character Prep 1" stenciled onto it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted a photograph of that twisted, stinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping noise, and the door opened slowly. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used my camera flash to look for a light switch on the wall by the door, but there was nothing there. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my sense of excitement by a loud electrical buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashed to light, flickering and fading in and out of the rest as I passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like all the lights was going to just keep getting brighter and brighter until the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought they had reached that critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and steadied. The room was exactly as I'd pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the wall, fully put together like strange cartoon cadavers hung from invisible nooses. There was an entire rack of loincloths and native clothes on hangers towards the back. What I found odd, and what I wanted to videograph right away, was a Mickey costume in the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was laying on its back in the center of the room like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, though, was the coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of the actual Mickey. Black where he should be white, and white where he should be black. His normally red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting, so off-putting that I actually put off photographing that thing until last. I took pictures of the costumes hanging on the walls, upward angles, downward angles, side shots, to show entire rows of frozen putrid cartoon faces, some even with the plastic eyes missing. I then decided to stage a single shot, just one of the bedraggled characters' heads on the sick, grimy floor. I reached for the headpiece of the Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud clattering noise made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained looking at me. I dropped the duck immediately, as you would expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had taken a picture of it, you know. I had to. I had to do it. For any number of reasons that may seem silly, but if only you don't think it through. I need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was somehow going to try and make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, that photo negative, opposite Mickey, in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First, sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey costume, or whoever was inside it, stood at the center of the room. Its fake face just started staring at me directly. "No," it mumbled, over and over. "No," it said as it started to sway side to side. "No," its voice becoming more aggressive and deep. With shaking hands and a violent thrashing heart and legs that had once turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went black. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey costume. "Hey," it said in a hush, perverted but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse's voice. "You want to see my head come off?" It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsily glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of the predator's jaws. It began working its digits into its own neck. Blood. There was so much blood. So much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard the sickening tear of cloth and flesh. I only cared about getting away. Above the doorway to this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. "Abandoned by God." I never got the pictures out of the camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. I ran from the palace, fled for my sanity, if not my very own life. I knew why Disney wanted no one to know about this place. They didn't want anything